The huge error of omission is that Boeing failed to disclose the existence of MCAS to the pilot community.
This is a joke. This airplane is ridiculous.
But if even Boeing engineers don't trust Boeing, why should we?
It was the aftermath of the tragic air crashes where 2 Boeing 737 MAXs were lost along with 346 lives. In the earlier part of this series, we discussed the engineering behind 737 MAX and the flawed software that contributed to both the flight disasters. Evidences have pointed to the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS, as the main culprit. The presence of MCAS in Boeing 737 MAX was intentionally omitted from the pilot's handbook. Pilots were not aware that there was a system that could take over the control of the planes they were flying. Furthermore, Boeing managed to convince the FAA and airlines that pilots simply need to complete a few hours of training on their iPads, and simulator trainings are not necessary. Boeing had intentionally omitted such an important feature, as they wanted to meet the goal of having the MAX certified as another 737 version, so that it would appeal to airlines with the reduced cost of pilot training. Revealing the MCAS meant more pilot training, more hours in the flight simulation rooms, and higher costs. The U.S. Pilot Union president, Daniel Carey, later said,
"The huge error of omission is that Boeing failed to disclose the existence of MCAS to the pilot community. The final fatal mistake was, therefore, the absence of robust pilot training in the event that the MCAS failed."
Despite being laden with technical issues, Boeing managed to obtain the certifications from FAA, and proceeded to push the 737 MAX to the commercial airlines. With all the promised cost savings measures checked marked, this plane received warm welcome from the airlines. The cash registers at Boeing started ringing once again, until the fateful days of the crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia. There is still a missing link to this story. The series of events were in sharp contrasts with the reputation of Boeing. This is a company that is highly regarded globally, one that represents the apotheosis in aerospace engineering. Such practices would never have enabled the company to achieve its years of good track record since establishment in 1916. What happened to the once innovative and problem-resolving culture of Boeing?
In August 1997, McDonnell Douglas merged with Boeing, after the latter acquired Rockwell a year earlier. McDonnell Douglas was a major American aerospace manufacturing corporation and defense contractor. It produced well-known commercial and military aircrafts. The DC-10 airliner, the F-15 Eagle Air Superiority Fighter and the F/A-18 Hornet multi-role fighter were few prominent products under its wing. Boeing's new acquisition had allowed the company to diversify, opening itself to new streams of revenue. With the lucrative government contracts it picked up with McDonnell Douglas and Rockwell, Boeing's comparatively fledgling space and defense operations could flourish. The deal was materialized through a $13 billion stock swap, with Boeing as the surviving company. Boeing also introduced a new corporate identity based on the McDonnell Douglas logo. The industry, however, was not so accommodative with this merger. There was a bitter joke coming out of Seattle that McDonnell Douglas was using Boeing's money to buy Boeing. The entire deal felt as if McDonnell Douglas was acquiring Boeing. As the deal was done through stock swap, McDonnell Douglas did not pay anything in the merger. Even though Boeing was described as the surviving company in the merger, the culture of Boeing slowly became more and more of McDonnell Douglas. Some even said that Boeing's leadership had decided to divorce itself from the firm's own culture on the day of the merger. This started at the management structure of Boeing. Harry Stonecipher, a former GE executive and CEO of McDonnell Douglas, became COO of the combined companies, and he eventually became the CEO. Cost controlling and the maximization of shareholders' wealth became the biggest concerns. The new management began looking into restructuring business operations. resulting to layoffs and reductions to employee pensions. Outsourcing and automations took the places that were once managed by the hardworking and innovative engineers. At Wall Street, Boeing extended its tradition of technical engineering into financial engineering. It started engaging in share buybacks. This is a measure where the company uses its capital to buy back its own shares in the market. Often, this inflates the prices of the remaining shares still traded in the market. This in turn increased the investors' return on investments, making Boeing one of the favorite stocks at Wall Street. In 2015, with Boeing shares on the rise, the next new CEO Dennis Muilenburg took the share buyback schemes to the next aggressive level. Over the next 5 years from 2014, Boeing repurchased $38 billion of its own shares. While the company's resources were channeled into the share buyback schemes, the employees were losing their pensions and jobs to cheaper overseas countries through outsourcing. Boeing started focusing less on its product and more on financial engineering its market worth. In less than a decade, the share price of Boeing tripled and Muilenburg was well loved by Wall Street. Back in Seattle, where most of Boeing's manufacturing operations were located, most people would assume that their headquarters were also in Seattle. It puts the management closer to its operations. After the merger, however, Boeing's headquarters was moved from Seattle to Chicago, and then to Virginia. The official reasoning for this was that Boeing wanted a more central location for their headquarters. But in reality, it was to separate their engineers and leadership. This would make it easier for leadership to implement a questionable cost-cutting measures while minimizing backlash from engineers. Eventually, one of the most successful engineering cultures of all time gave in to the McDonnell mindset. When asked about the impact of the merger on leadership and what that meant operationally for Boeing, Robinson, who conducted hundreds of hours of interviews with Boeing engineers, said,
"The culture of Boeing became all about its schedule, its cost, its shareholder value, and that stems directly from the influence of some of the top leadership who came from McDonnell Douglas in the late 90s.
Over the next couple of years, Boeing would aggressively outsource airplane construction, integrating more than 50 partners. Pretty soon they got to a point where the majority of parts weren't even produced by Boeing. Boeing factory is turned into assembly plants where pre-made parts were just bought together. This is extremely dangerous given their industry. When Apple's contractors screw up and their iPhones end up bending, it's not a big deal. But when Boeing's contractors screw up and the flaps don't work or their cargo door doesn't close, it's deadly, literally. One Boeing employee commented,
This is a joke. This airplane is ridiculous. And that this was the way back in 2016 years, before either incident.
Another employee wrote,
I honestly don't trust many people at Boeing. Clearly, engineers at Boeing knew that the 737 MAX wasn't a fit to fly. Yet the aircraft managed to pass all of its inspections with flying colors, and hundreds of millions of people continue to find Boeing aircraft, including many world leaders. But if even Boeing engineers don't trust Boeing, why should we?
Did you know that the US subprime mortgage crisis, during 2007 to 2009, was triggered by financial engineering? If you would like to find out more about this, type subprime in the commentaries below. I will make a video on this topic, if there are enough requests.
On December 23, 2019, Boeing announced that Muilenburg resigned as the CEO and board director, in the aftermath of the two crashes of Boeing's 737 MAX. Although he forfeited stock worth $14.6 million, Muilenburg was contractually entitled to receive $62.2 million in stock and pension awards. This payment by Boeing attracted criticism. U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren wrote regarding the payment by Boeing.
346 people died, and yet, Dennis Muilenburg pressured regulators and put profits ahead of the safety of passengers, pilots, and flight attendants. He'll walk away with an additional $62.2 million. This is corruption, plain and simple.
At the court proceedings, Boeing agreed in January 2021 to pay more than $2.5 billion in illegal settlements. This included a $500 million compensation fund for victims' relatives, $1.77 billion in compensation to the airlines, and a $243 million criminal fine to the SEC with the Justice Department. Boeing's payment to SEC was to settle civil charges by SEC for misleading investors about its 737 MAX. The SEC quoted that, in times of crisis and tragedy, it is especially important that public companies and executives provide full, fair, and truthful disclosures. The SEC charged Boeing and CEO Muhlenberg with making materially misleading public statements following crashes of Boeing airplanes in 2018 and 2019. However, Boeing is not criminally charged for causing the deaths of the victims of the ill-fated flights. The families of victims of the two Boeing 737 MAX crashes asked a Texas judge to overturn a $2.5 billion settlement between the aircraft manufacturer and the U.S. government. Apparently, Boeing won immunity from criminal prosecution as part of this settlement agreement, so that Department of Justice can drop some of the proceedings against it over the deadly crashes. A French woman who lost her 28-year-old daughter when the Ethiopian Airlines plane crashed, said,
"They messed up by making the crime fraud rather than manslaughter. We believe that the rights of the victims' families have not been respected. We have not been consulted."
In August 2020, the FAA published requirements for fixing each aircraft and improving pilot training. An FAA airworthiness directive approved design changes for each MAX aircraft, which would prevent MCAS activation unless both angle of attack sensors register similar readings, eliminate MCAS's ability to repeatedly activate, and allow pilots to override the system if necessary. The FAA began requiring all MAX pilots to undergo MCAS-related training in flight simulators by 2021. On November 18, 2020, the FAA ended the 20-month grounding, the longest ever of a U.S. airliner. The MAX resumed commercial flights in the U.S. in December 2020. Canadian and European authorities only followed in late January 2021, as over 180 countries out of 195 had lifted the grounding. China was one of the last countries to recertify the Boeing 737 MAX, after the jet was grounded. A Boeing 737 MAX operated by China Southern Airlines took off from Guangzhou in January 2023. This is the first time a Chinese airline has operated the jet for a commercial flight in almost 4 years. Over 450 Boeing 737 MAX aircraft were awaiting delivery in November 2020, 335 remained by January 2022. Boeing estimated that the backlog would be largely cleared by the end of 2023, after its order book was reduced by almost 1,000 aircraft, due to cancellations from loss of trust in the aircraft. On the 19th of January 2023, a federal judge ordered Boeing to appear in court 1 week later to be arraigned on a 2021 felony charge after families of those killed in two fatal crashes object to a 2021 plea deal.